My name is Layla Young, and at 35 years old, I thought I had it all figured out. For the past 5 years, I had been living with Edward Hall, my boyfriend of the same duration, raising his two children as if they were my own. Ethan, 14, was a lanky, energetic teen obsessed with video games and lacrosse. Lily, 12, was shy but endlessly curious, always asking questions that made me feel like I was nurturing a tiny philosopher. Their biological father lived across the country, rarely around, contributing barely anything, and showing up for maybe 2 weekends a year. For me, it didn't matter. I was there, every single day. I drove Ethan to soccer practice, helped Lily with her science fair projects, stayed up late explaining algebra when she got stuck, and made sure both had the tools and resources to thrive. I paid for their private school tuition, $18,000 per child each year. I covered health insurance, braces, therapy sessions for Lily's anxiety, uniforms, sports fees, clothes, phone bills, you name it. I didn't just support them financially, I supported them emotionally, offering a presence and a stability their father never could. And for years, I believed this counted for something. I believed Edward saw me as more than just a girlfriend. I believed we were a family. That illusion shattered 2 weeks ago. It started with a conversation about holiday plans. We were sitting at the kitchen island, Lily doodling in her notebook, Ethan scrolling on his phone. I casually mentioned taking the kids to visit my parents, as we had done every year. Edward set down his coffee, his eyes sharp, voice unexpectedly cold. "Layla," he said, "we need to talk about boundaries." I froze, pretending not to hear the undercurrent in his tone. "Boundaries?" I repeated, trying to mask the sudden flutter of panic in my chest. "Yes," he said, leaning back. "The kids are confused about your role. You're not their mother. You need to know your place. You're just my girlfriend." The words hit me like ice water. My hands went numb. I could hear the echo of every birthday I organized, every late-night homework session, every scraped knee I patched up. None of it mattered. In his eyes, I was a guest in their lives, not a mother, not even someone with real influence. "So what am I to them, Edward?" I asked quietly, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "You're my partner," he said flatly. "But that's it. Stop trying to parent them. You agreed to help with their education, yes, but don't overstep. You're not their mom." The conversation escalated quickly. I asked about tuition, health insurance, all the expenses I'd shouldered for years. "Who's paying for their school now?" I asked, my voice tight. "Their father can handle that," he said dismissively, "or you can figure out what you're comfortable with. Just know your place." I didn't cry. Not yet. I simply nodded, stunned into silence. 5 years of love, care, and devotion reduced to a single, icy phrase, just a girlfriend. That night, after Ethan and Lily were asleep, I sat in my home office. The quiet was deafening. I replayed the conversation in my head, over and over. Boundaries. Know my place. Not their mother. Each word burned into me. I realized something crucial. If I let this go, I would be erased, my contributions taken for granted. If I wanted respect or justice, I had to act. The next morning, I began quietly undoing the financial support I had provided for half a decade. First, I called my health insurance provider and removed the children from my plan, effective at the end of the month. Then I contacted the private school. Tuition for the spring semester would no longer be covered. And finally, I reached out to my old apartment manager. I still had a unit available if I needed it. Within 3 hours, I had set in motion the consequences of Edward's words. At dinner, I acted normal. I helped Lily with algebra and laughed at Ethan's gaming stories. Edward didn't notice, or pretended not to. I could see the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes, completely unaware of what was coming. Monday morning, the consequences began to unfold. Edward got an email from the school. Tuition for both children, $36,000, was now due. He called me repeatedly, texts flooding in. "Layla, what did you do? You can't do this to the kids. Call me back." I replied once calmly, "I'm respecting the boundaries you set." He didn't know how to respond. The carefully built life we shared, built on my shoulders, was crumbling in front of him. And I felt a strange, quiet satisfaction. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was simply letting Edward face the reality of the role he had insisted I leave behind. That evening, as the children laughed and talked about their day, oblivious to the financial upheaval looming over them, I realized that clarity had arrived. Edward had given me the definition of my role. I was simply a girlfriend, no more, no less, and I was about to test what that meant in practice. The line had been drawn, and now I would make sure it was seen, understood, and felt. The following morning, the apartment felt heavier. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, but it didn't warm the weight pressing on my chest. I brewed my coffee slowly, savoring each sip, as if to remind myself I was still in control. For years, I had poured myself into Edward's family, giving everything I had, and now that devotion had been dismissed with a few careless words. Just know your place. It was time to honor his boundaries, in the most literal sense possible. First, I organized my finances. I contacted the school again to confirm that the spring semester payments were officially canceled from my account. Next, I checked with the health insurance provider. Lily and Ethan would no longer be covered under my plan. I knew the practical implications: therapy sessions, ADHD medication, routine checkups. Everything would fall to Edward and the children's father if he wanted it done. Then came the apartment. For 3 years, I had been paying roughly 75% of the rent. Edward contributed $700. I covered $2,100. I made a few calls, confirmed my old apartment unit was available, and quietly began moving my essentials. Important documents, clothes, and valuables were packed first. Slowly, methodically, I carved out my independence, letting the chaos of reality ripple through his world. That evening, at dinner, I acted completely normal. I helped Lily with her algebra homework, listened to Ethan recount his gaming tournament, and laughed when he made an exaggerated story about a close call. Edward watched me carefully, a faint frown pulling at his lips. He thought I had accepted my place. He had no idea. By Monday, the first wave of panic hit him. An email from the school. Tuition for the spring semester was due, $36,000. He called my phone repeatedly, texts flooding in. "Layla, what did you do? This isn't funny. You can't do this to the kids." I replied once, calm and precise. "I'm respecting the boundaries you set. Their father can handle their education." Silence on the other end. Then a voice tight with frustration. "Layla, you can't do this. The kids, you're hurting them." I didn't answer. I let him stew. He had drawn the line. I was just walking along it. As the week progressed, Edward's ex, Vanessa, started to notice the tension. She had always lingered at the edges, making casual suggestions about the kids' schedules and subtly questioning my authority. Now she was visibly uneasy. She could sense the shift in power, but I was careful. My focus was not on her. It was on the consequences Edward had invited. I moved into my old apartment slowly. Not a dramatic reveal, just quiet steps toward reclaiming autonomy. A few boxes each day, a change of address for bills, nothing overt. Edward noticed, but didn't intervene at first. He assumed I was overreacting, or worse, trying to punish him. He didn't see that I was simply respecting the boundary he had drawn. By Thursday, the insurance cards arrived. Only mine. The kids were no longer covered. Edward called me, voice rising in disbelief. "Layla, how could you do this? Lily needs her therapy. Ethan needs his medication." I sipped my tea and said quietly, "Their father can provide coverage. I'm respecting the boundaries you insisted on." His frustration turned to anger, and anger turned to desperation. He tried guilt, manipulation, even pleading. "The kids are suffering. You're being unreasonable." I didn't argue. I simply repeated, calmly, "I am not their mother. You told me to know my place. I'm following through." That night, he attempted charm and distraction. Dinner prepared just so, Lily and Ethan hugging me, subtle gestures meant to sway me. I smiled politely, played along, but inside I was already thinking 3 steps ahead. My plan wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. By the weekend, Edward's panic became almost tangible. He realized that every aspect of the life we had built depended on my involvement. Tuition, rent, groceries, utilities. Everything I had covered effortlessly was suddenly his problem. Vanessa suggested solutions, but none were feasible. Edward's carefully constructed sense of dominance was slipping, and there was nothing he could do to stop it without acknowledging the role I had played all these years. Meanwhile, I watched the children. I still helped Lily with homework, still encouraged Ethan's ambitions, but with a quiet detachment. They sensed the tension, but I refused to let it break the stability I was creating for myself. I loved them, but I would no longer be invisible or dismissed. And so the lines were drawn. Edward had defined my place in his world, a girlfriend with no authority, no responsibility, no role in the children's lives beyond superficial presence. I had simply honored that definition. What happened next, I knew, would test everything. The financial consequences, the emotional fallout, the delicate threads holding this family together, all of it was about to unravel. And I, for the first time in years, would step back and watch it unfold with clarity, precision, and a sense of empowerment I had never felt before. 3 weeks had passed since I first respected Edward's boundaries, and the ripple effects were becoming undeniable. What had started as a quiet, calculated response was now a full-blown upheaval. The apartment was quieter without the clutter of extra voices, but the world outside, Edward world, was chaos. The first signs were subtle. I'd hear snippets of calls he was having, muttered frustrations, and the occasional exasperated sigh as he tried to cover expenses I had quietly withdrawn from. Tuition for Ethan and Lily? Not paid. Health insurance? Gone. Rent? I had stopped contributing, leaving him scrambling to cover the full $2,800. Groceries, utilities, therapy sessions, all my previous contributions were suddenly gone. Edward's ex, Vanessa, had begun to insert herself more aggressively. She called, texted, and made subtle inquiries about the kids' welfare, planting seeds of doubt and panic. But her efforts only exposed the truth. Edward had relied entirely on me for 5 years, and now, without my support, the house of cards was collapsing. I still interacted with the children daily, carefully balancing warmth with distance. I helped Lily with her homework, offered encouragement to Ethan, but I refused to shoulder responsibilities Edward had publicly declared were not mine. I watched as confusion rippled through them. Ethan would ask, "Why aren't we doing our usual activities?" Lily would whisper, Layla, why is school different?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I reminded myself of his words. "You're not their mother. Know your place." I was following his instructions to the letter. The financial reality for Edward hit hardest when bills began arriving. Utilities surged, groceries skyrocketed, and new insurance premiums through his employer added hundreds more per month. His attempts at sweet talk, manipulation, and guilt were predictable, almost cinematic in their futility. "I'm just trying to help," he would say, frustration lacing his tone. "The kids need stability." I let him stew. I reminded him calmly, "You set the boundary, I'm respecting it." He tried escalating, calling my family, pleading for mediation, attempting to guilt-trip me through the children. But each time I repeated the same truth. I wasn't their mother. I had no parental obligation. Everything I had done was voluntary and predicated on the assumption that we were building a family together. That assumption had been destroyed in a single conversation, and now I was living in clarity. Then came the shock that I hadn't fully anticipated, the children's reactions. They began to sense the collapse around them. Ethan, proud and ambitious, realized that lacrosse tryouts, private school scholarships, and his position on the team were threatened. Lily, sensitive and loyal, panicked about losing her school, her friends, and the stability she had always relied upon. Their mother, Edward, was scrambling, and they began to cling to the one constant they still trusted, me. One evening, Lily came to my apartment quietly. "Layla, can I stay here tonight?" she asked, tears brimming. "Mom said I can't. I hate the new place. I hate it." I held her close, a surge of conflicting emotions crashing through me. She wasn't mine legally, but she had come to me as a child seeking safety and care, the very role Edward had told me I did not have. My heart ached for her, but I knew I couldn't break the lines I had drawn. I called Edward immediately. "Lily's here," I said, voice calm. His panic was palpable. "You can't do this." I reminded him gently, "You told me to know my place. I am following through. She's safe, and I will care for her within reason. You set the boundary." How? Edward's silence spoke volumes. He understood fully. The person he had dismissed as just a girlfriend was now the stabilizing force he had ignored, and he had no choice but to face it. The tipping point came when he realized just how dependent he had been on me. Rent, tuition, insurance, groceries, utilities, over $3,800 per month in expenses that I had quietly withdrawn from. His $52,000 salary barely stretched to cover essentials, let alone the sudden surge of responsibilities. By now, Vanessa was frantically attempting to orchestrate a solution, involving Edward's distant father and even trying to convince him to step in financially. But each attempt only revealed one truth. Edward had allowed me to do everything for 5 years. Without me, the facade crumbled. And yet, through it all, I remained steady, calm, calculated, compassionate, but firm. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was allowing the consequences of Edward's words and choices to unfold. I watched, sometimes with a pang of regret, sometimes with quiet satisfaction, as the world Edward had assumed I would always uphold began to unravel. For the first time in years, I felt the surge of autonomy, the power of being seen clearly, not as a girlfriend, not as a shadow figure, but as a person capable of setting boundaries and watching the truth emerge. The chaos was far from over, but one thing had become undeniably clear. My presence, my devotion, my care had value, whether Edward was willing to acknowledge it or not, and the consequences he had invited would be the lesson he couldn't ignore. The start of the new semester marked the full impact of Edward's dependency on me. Ethan and Lily had been transferred to public school after I withdrew my financial support, and the transition was brutal. Ethan went from being a star lacrosse player in a private school, scouted for potential scholarships, to blending into a sea of unfamiliar faces with zero recognition. Lily, once confident among her private school friends, now faced whispers and sideways glances. Anxiety crept back into her posture and speech. Therapy sessions had been paused due to insurance issues. Edward was frantic. He called constantly, texted with desperation, and began shifting blame everywhere except himself. Vanessa, sensing an opportunity, tried to insert herself as the savior, offering advice about schedules, new school options, and even urging him to contact the children's father for extra support. But nothing was enough. The reality was clear. He had relied entirely on me, and now that support was gone. I stayed removed but attentive. When Lily called me one evening, voice trembling, I let her explain what had happened at school. "I don't fit in, Layla." "Everything's different," she said. My heart ached. I longed to swoop in, shield her from the chaos, but I reminded myself of the lines I had drawn. I could not undo the consequences. Edward had chosen to define my place, and I had to respect it. Still, I offered what I could: practical guidance, reassurance that she was capable, and the comfort of a listening ear. She trusted me, and Ethan did too. Despite Edward's protests, the children knew the truth. I had been the real constant in their lives. Edward's panic escalated as the bills piled up. The apartment now required him to cover $2,800 in rent alone. Utilities, groceries, insurance, and school fees meant an extra $3,800 per month, far beyond his comfort zone. He tried negotiation, pleading, even guilt. "Layla, the kids are suffering. You're being unreasonable," he shouted one evening. I reminded him calmly, "You told me to know my place. I am. I'm not their mother. You set the boundary." His frustration became visible to everyone. Vanessa attempted intervention again, calling him repeatedly, trying to coordinate the children's father into contributing more support. Ethan overheard one call, confusion and anger burning in his eyes. He texted me later, "Why is Mom letting this happen? You've done everything for us. Why is she just letting us struggle?" I replied with careful honesty, "I'm following the boundaries your mom set. She said I'm not your parent, so I'm respecting that. You can trust that I care for you, but I cannot take the place I was told I don't have." The children were shaken, but they began to understand something crucial. My care had always been real. It had not vanished, even as the world around them became unstable. Meanwhile, Edward's scramble to adjust was a spectacle of desperation. He had to move to a smaller apartment, navigate the impossibility of paying private school tuition without my contributions, and attempt to maintain a facade of control. Vanessa tried to swoop in as the problem solver, but her interference only highlighted how much the family had depended on me for 5 years. Even as I observed the chaos, I never lost my composure. I helped Lily with algebra, encouraged Ethan in his gaming tournament, but my involvement was measured and deliberate. I refused to enable Edward's illusion of authority. He had made a choice, and now he lived with it. The children slowly began reaching out to me behind the scenes. Secret messages, quiet visits, seeking the guidance and stability I had always provided. Each moment reinforced the truth. I had been more than a girlfriend. I had been a parental figure, a protector, a presence they could trust. And despite the boundaries Edward had demanded, that role could not be erased. By the end of the month, the consequences were clear. Public school had exposed the children to social challenges they had never faced. Edward's financial stress mounted daily. Vanessa's attempts at intervention failed repeatedly. And I felt the first real sense of empowerment in years. For the first time, I was untethered from the illusion of family I had been forced to navigate. I was finally in control of my life, my choices, and my boundaries. And I knew deep down that the hardest lessons were only just beginning. For Edward, for the children, and for everyone who had underestimated me. By the time the new semester was in full swing, I had settled into my own apartment completely. The boxes were unpacked, the furniture arranged just so, and for the first time in years, the space felt entirely mine. The air felt lighter. I was free. Not from love, not from loyalty, but from the invisible chains that had kept me trapped in a role Edward had decided I didn't deserve. Edward was a shell of the man I had known. He struggled with the children's transition to public school. Ethan's grades dropped, his lacrosse dreams disrupted. Lily's anxiety worsened without her therapy sessions. Edward scrambled financially, barely managing rent and utilities, while Vanessa hovered, trying to manipulate the situation to her favor. Every desperate call, every frantic message, reminded me that I had made the right choice. And yet the children still reached for me. One evening, Lily appeared at my door, a small suitcase in hand. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her expression pleading. "Layla, you're the only parent I've ever really known. Can I stay here tonight? I hate the new place," she whispered. My heart tightened. This was the child I had nurtured, the one who trusted me unconditionally, now facing the consequences of boundaries Edward had forced me to respect. I let her in, offered comfort, and reminded her gently, "You're safe here. We'll figure this out together." Edward called immediately. "Layla, you can't have her there. She's not your child." I replied calmly, almost coldly. "You made that very clear. I am respecting boundaries. She's safe, and I am caring for her within reason. You set the lines. Now live with them." The desperation in his voice was palpable, a mixture of guilt and disbelief. Vanessa tried to intervene, but even she could see the truth. The children's loyalty was quietly shifting. They had always known who had been their anchor, their constant, and it wasn't Edward. Weeks passed. Birthday celebrations, small victories, quiet moments of reassurance. I remained present, consistent, and steady. Ethan asked if I could help him get his learner's permit, a promise I had made long ago. When he asked, I reminded him gently, "Ask your mom." He did, and the resulting chaos underscored the reality Edward had ignored. My role was irreplaceable, yet invisible to those who failed to see it. Meanwhile, Edward attempted reconciliation, his tone pleading and desperate. Offers to pay back tuition, to regain some control over the household, even attempts to manipulate the children's feelings. None of it worked. I declined. Calmly, confidently. The boundaries had been set. The consequences had been lived. In the midst of all this, I met someone new. Eric. Kind, patient, uncomplicated. No children, no financial entanglements, no emotional drama. We took things slowly, savoring the quiet moments I had long been denied. Life, for the first time in years, felt uncomplicated and mine. Then, by chance, I ran into Edward at a coffee shop. He looked older, more worn, exhausted. I approached with a calm smile. "Layla, how are you managing?" he asked hesitantly. "Good," I said simply. "You?" The kids, they miss you," he admitted. I smiled softly, gently, but without regret. "That's unfortunate. I miss them too. But remember, when you told me I wasn't their mother, you set the boundary. I respected it. You made your choice." He looked at me, realization dawning, and then he walked away. A text arrived that evening from Vanessa. "You destroyed our family," I replied, cold and precise. "There was no our family. That was your family, and I was just your girlfriend who needed to know her place. I know my place now. It's nowhere near you." Blocked her number after that. The children still reach out occasionally. I respond politely but remain distant, honoring the lines that were once forced upon me. They are good kids, resilient and intelligent, but they are not my children. And yet, I know that the love I poured into their lives shaped them more than Edward ever realized. Sometimes you don't recognize what you have until it's gone, and sometimes by the time you do, it's too late. I am Layla Young. I gave love, care, and devotion. I was dismissed, and I rose, stronger, independent, and finally free.